The president is focused on offense. He says nothing short of an act of God will convince him to drop out of his reelection campaign. Just over the weekend, 4 more senior House Democrats, including Congressman Jerry Nadler, called on Biden to abandon his race in a private call. Congressman Adam Schiff stopped short of calling on the president to step down, but did say he needs to, quote, win overwhelmingly or pass the torch. And despite reporting last week suggesting the president was on the fence about the future of his campaign, publicly, the president is being very clear. He says the calls only help Trump and hurt the Democrats. In a letter that he wrote just this morning to congressional Democrats, the president wrote, among other things, I would not be running again if I did not absolutely believe I was the best person to beat Donald Trump in 2024. We had a Democratic nomination process. The voters have spoken clearly and decisively. The voters, and the voters alone, decide the nominee of the Democratic Party. The president was even more pointed towards those calling for a ticket refresh on our air right here on MSNBC this morning when he phoned into Morning Joe.
I don't care what those big names think. They're wrong in 2020. They're wrong in 2022 about the red wave. They're wrong in 2024. And come out with me. Watch people react. You make a judgment. You make a judgment. I'm getting so frustrated by the elites. Now, I'm not talking about you guys, but about the elites in the party who they know so much more. But if any of these guys don't think I should run against me, go ahead, announce for president. Challenge me at the convention.
You could feel and hear that frustration by the president. The question many have is, well, what happens next? As the president himself noted this morning, there are just over 40 days until the Democratic convention and exactly 120 days until the general. So let's get started. Joining us now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles and NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa. Ali, just this morning, we had a 2-page letter from the president and a live interview right here on Morning Joe. Walk us through the strategy here when it comes to these calls from some members of Congress.
Yeah, Jose, well, you'll remember the White House waited almost a week before formally and publicly answering questions in a press briefing about the president's poor debate performance on June 27th. And that debate performance, the briefing really centered around that poor debate performance. And the White House received some criticism from lawmakers for waiting that long, saying waiting that long really only fostered and allowed these concerns to grow among members of Congress. And today, the Biden team appears to be realizing that they're launching this all-hands-on-deck effort to really prove that the president is defiant, is going to stay in this race. He even on that interview with on Morning Joe this morning challenged other Democrats to challenge him at the convention next month. The president in that interview, frustrated at times, saying that he doesn't care what members of the establishment, members of the elite, as he called them, says, that he only cares about the opinions of average voters. He says that the voters that he interacted with over the weekend in Michigan and battleground Pennsylvania actually gave him the confidence to prove to himself that he should stay in this race and serve another 4 years in office. But of course, we're seeing the focus today on Congress as these lawmakers come back to Capitol Hill for the first time since that debate, and we see a growing number of them call for him to step aside. The White House is really harnessing this outreach effort. The president making several calls to lawmakers, trying to reassure them that he can stay in this race. You mentioned that lengthy letter to these Democratic lawmakers in which the president really reminded them of the democratic process that got him to this point, reminded him that the president is the nominee because he went through an entire primary process. And so right now, the White House is really focusing on how to stop the bleeding, how to quiet these concerns among these lawmakers to really stop the division in this party from growing. The big question now, though, Jose, is whether and how much that will make an impact among these Democratic lawmakers.
Yeah, I mean, and Ryan, I mean, Karine Jean-Pierre was very clear that this offense didn't start today with the letter and Morning Joe. I mean, the president, she was clearly saying, visited 6 states just in the last couple of days alone. And I'm just wondering, Ryan, have any of the sitting lawmakers who have called on the president to step down expressed what they suggest should happen going forward?
Yeah, Jose, I mean, many of these lawmakers that have specifically called on President Biden to step down have suggested a wide range of steps forward for the Democratic Party. Some have suggested an open mini primary where the convention delegates select who the next nominee will be. Others, perhaps the majority of those who have asked for President Biden to step aside, have coalesced around Vice President Kamala Harris as the standard bearer of the party. Many of them believe that that's the best path forward. But I do have to say, Jose, there's not wide consensus on any of these points in the halls of Congress right now. There does seem to be a bit of a scattershot approach to this among both senators and members of the House of Representatives. You have some that are outright coalescing around Joe Biden, saying that they support him all the way, that they want him to stay in the race. You have a small gaggle of House Democrats who are publicly saying that he should step aside. And then there's a wide number of both senators and House members who are having it both ways, who are saying that they want to see more from the president, that they do have concerns about his debate performance, that they have concerns as to whether or not he could win the race. And they want to see this process play itself out and for the president to really have a thoughtful conversation with himself about whether or not he can stay in the race. One of those people is Senator Joe Manchin, who we caught up with just a few minutes ago, and I believe we have some tape of that conversation.
Do you think the election is winnable for President Biden at this point?
Oh, I think it's winnable, sure. I do. I've always said, Donald Trump is a threat, but the democracy as we know it. So I think people are taking that very seriously, and yeah, you can't call the race now. I mean, this is ridiculous. This early for people to get so excited. The bottom line is just wait till this week, give it another week. It's only been a week and what, 3 days, 3 or 4 days?
You said give it another week, so are you keeping an open mind on whether you want to see the president step aside in this race?
My thing is to find out what direction that the president is going to go. He's said very clearly what he wants to do and what he will do.
What do you want to see from him?
Well, I think that basically, we'll see he's very active now and everything. That's good.
So you see there, Joe Manchin not officially ruling out the idea that he may actually call on Joe Biden to step down. Of course, he's not your average Democrat. He actually left the Democratic Party. He's an independent now. He even flirted with the idea of running as a third-party candidate for president of the United States, but backed away from that. But what Joe Manchin said is indicative of kind of the decision-making process that you see playing out with many senators that are at least supporters of Joe Biden. They want to see more from this president. They want to know what the plan is to beat Donald Trump in the fall. Many feel like they haven't gotten that plan yet, which is why you're not seeing this overwhelming rush of support behind Biden and his candidacy at the current moment, Jose.
Just wondering if many that say they haven't seen the plan yet, haven't been reading anything that the president has been writing or been hearing what the president's been saying for months now. I mean, in this letter to lawmakers today, I just wanted to read you another bit of it because I think it's important. It says, I feel a deep obligation to the faith and trust the voters of the Democratic Party have placed in me to run this year. It was their decision to make, not the press, not the pundits, not the big donors, not any selected group of individuals, no matter how well-intentioned. The voters and the voters alone decide the nominee of the Democratic Party. How can we stand for democracy in our nation if we ignore it in our own party? I cannot do that, says the president. I will not do that. And Ryan, on the other side, you have people like Congressman Richie Torres. He put out a statement on X saying, in part, those publicly calling on President Biden to withdraw should ask themselves a simple question. What if the president becomes the Democratic nominee? The drip, drip, drip of public statements of no confidence only serve to weaken the president, who has been weakened not only by the debate, but also by the debate about the debate. Weakening a weakened nominee seems like a losing strategy for a presidential election. The piling on is not so much solving a problem as much as it is creating and compounding a new one. How heavily is that likely possibility weighing on those yet to speak out in Congress?
Jose, I think that is the definitive reason why you're seeing a bit of ambivalence among many of these members of Congress. I can tell you from my own conversations with a wide range of Democrats, there is overwhelming anxiety that Joe Biden has what it takes to beat Donald Trump in the fall. Many of them were concerned he was already losing the race before this debate, and this just exacerbated that problem. But to your point, and to Congressman Torres's point, there is an even greater anxiety that if they can't convince him to step aside on his own accord, and that it requires some sort of public detente where you see Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer publicly call on him to step down, and he still refuses to do so, that would so mortally wound the Democratic Party that they would have absolutely no shot at winning this election. Many Democrats are concerned. They're not 100% sure he can win, but as you saw there from Joe Manchin, they believe it's still a winnable race if Joe Biden is the nominee, but they just want to make 100% sure that he is up to the challenge over the next couple of months, and then up to the challenge of serving as president for another 4 years. And that's part of why there's this feeling out period that we're going through now. But to the point of Congressman Torres, it cannot last for very long, because the longer it goes on, the more it affects Joe Biden as a candidate.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.